The words, "just my wife," hung in the air like toxic smoke as I stood in the back of the ballroom, champagne flute frozen halfway to my lips. Just his wife. After 15 years of marriage, 3 career relocations to support his ambitions, and countless nights spent helping him rehearse presentations while he climbed the corporate ladder at Reynolds Tech, I was reduced to an afterthought, a footnote in James Foster's success story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I watched my husband accept his Executive of the Year award, his handsome face glowing under the spotlight as he thanked everyone from his assistant to his high school math teacher. Everyone except me. I should probably acknowledge my wife Rebecca, who's here somewhere, he added as an afterthought, scanning the crowd without actually finding my eyes. She's always been supportive. The audience clapped politely while my best friend Emma squeezed my hand under the table. What James didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 48 hours, I would be announced as the new majority owner of Reynolds Tech, and James's boss. I met James Foster during my final year of business school when we were both selected for the same competitive internship at Reynolds Tech, a mid-sized but rapidly growing software company specializing in cybersecurity solutions. James was charismatic, ambitious, and brilliant, the kind of person who commanded attention in every meeting without seeming to try. I was equally qualified but preferred working behind the scenes, analyzing patterns and opportunities others missed. We balanced each other perfectly, or so I thought. Our romance blossomed over late nights preparing pitch decks and early mornings grabbing coffee before strategy sessions. By graduation, we were inseparable, and within a year, we were married. "You're the brains, I'm the personality," James used to say in those early days, his arms wrapped around me as we dreamed about our future. Together, we'll be unstoppable. I believed him. I believed in us. When Reynolds offered us both entry-level positions after our internships, we celebrated by splurging on an expensive dinner we couldn't really afford. We clinked glasses and talked about climbing the corporate ladder together, perhaps even starting our own company someday. But over the next decade, our paths diverged dramatically. James rose quickly through the ranks, moving from project management to department head to director of business development. I advanced too, but more slowly, often taking lateral moves to accommodate our relocations for James's promotions. "It's just temporary," he would assure me. "Once I reach VP level, we'll prioritize your career." But that moment never seemed to arrive. Meanwhile, I built a reputation as a shrewd negotiator with an uncanny ability to identify promising acquisitions and partnerships. While James was the face that clients and executives recognized, I was the quiet force that often shaped our most successful strategies. 3 months ago, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly projections when Mark Reynolds himself called me. Mark was the 68-year-old founder of Reynolds Tech, a brilliant innovator who had built the company from nothing 30 years ago. Though he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations, he remained chairman of the board and the majority shareholder. "Rebecca, I need to speak with you. Privately. Can you meet me at the Westlake Club in an hour?" His voice had the gruff directness that had become his trademark. At the Westlake Club, a wood-paneled sanctuary for Houston's business elite, Mark was already nursing a scotch when I arrived. He nodded toward the chair across from him and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I'm selling my controlling interest in Reynolds," he stated flatly. "I've been watching you for years, Rebecca. You see patterns others miss. You understand this business at a level even some of my VPs don't. I want to sell to you." I nearly choked on my water. "That's flattering, Mark, but I don't have that kind of capital. We're talking hundreds of millions. I've already arranged the financing with Garrison Partners. They trust my judgment, and they've seen your track record. The terms are favorable." He slid a folder across the table. "I'm offering you 65% of my shares." It's enough to make you the largest individual shareholder and give you effective control of the company. My mind raced with questions, possibilities, and immediate practical concerns. Why me? Why not the current CEO? Or James, for that matter? He's been positioning himself for upper management for years. Mark's face darkened slightly. Thomas is a competent CEO, but he lacks vision for where technology is heading. As for James, he paused, choosing his words carefully. James is excellent at selling himself, but I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between someone who takes credit and someone who creates value. I should have been immediately elated, but instead, a cold realization washed over me. If Mark had observed this about James, what else had he seen? What else had others seen that I had been too close to notice? This stays between us until the paperwork is finalized, Mark insisted. The official announcement will come at the quarterly board meeting. Until then, absolute discretion is essential. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what he was proposing. I'll need to discuss this with James, I said reflexively. Mark gave me a long, evaluating look. Of course, he's your husband. But remember, this is a business decision, not a family one. The offer is to you, not to both of you. I left that meeting in a daze, the folder with preliminary terms tucked into my bag. That night, I planned to tell James everything over the dinner I'd prepared to celebrate his recent success securing a major new client. I was excited to share this turning point in my career, naively believing he would be proud, even if it meant a shift in our professional dynamic. But James never showed up for dinner. At 8:30 p.m., after my third unanswered text, I received a message. Landing big fish. Closing deal over drinks with Westfield team. Don't wait up. I sat alone at our dining table, candles burning down, the elaborate meal growing cold. This wasn't the first time James had chosen work over our plans, but something felt different. Perhaps it was the contrast between Mark's recognition of my abilities and James's increasing tendency to take me for granted. Or perhaps it was because I'd finally been offered the kind of opportunity James had always chased, and my first instinct had been to share it with him, while his successes increasingly felt like solo victories I wasn't invited to celebrate. Instead of confronting him that night, I made a decision. I would wait. I would observe. I would pay attention to what had perhaps been in front of me all along. Over the next few weeks, I noticed patterns I'd been too busy or too trusting to see. How James would casually mention ideas in meetings that I had shared with him the night before, without acknowledging their source. How he would schedule client dinners that required him to be unreachable for hours. How he had begun treating me more like an assistant than a partner, both at home and in professional settings. "Can you look over this proposal?" he would ask, tossing a file onto the kitchen counter before heading out for his morning run. No, please. No acknowledgement that he was asking me to spend my limited free time on his projects. When I occasionally pushed back, he would say, "Come on, Beck, we're a team. Your success is my success, right?" Somehow, that principle never seemed to work in reverse. 4 weeks after my meeting with Mark, I found myself waiting for James in the lobby of his office building. We were supposed to meet for lunch, but he was running late. Again. While waiting, I spotted Melissa, his assistant, rushing through the lobby with an armful of folders. "Rebecca," she said, seeming startled to see me. "Are you meeting James for lunch?" "Yes, if he ever makes it down," I replied with a smile. "Oh." Her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "He's still in his meeting with Alyssa from Westfield. They've been working closely on the new partnership." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "Alyssa Diaz, the VP of Operations?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Melissa nodded, then glanced at her watch. "They've been meeting a lot lately, for the partnership," she added quickly. Too quickly. That night, I checked our shared credit card statement for the first time in months. James and I had always maintained both joint and separate finances, a habit from our early career days when we wanted some independence. The statement showed multiple charges at the Archer Hotel downtown, a hotel less than 2 miles from our house. Why would James need a hotel room so close to home? The dates aligned perfectly with his late nights at the office and client meetings. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I called Emma, who had been my closest friend since college, and now worked as a corporate attorney specializing in mergers and acquisitions. "I think James is having an affair," I said without preamble when she answered. "And I'm being offered controlling interest in Reynolds." There was a pause before Emma responded. "Which piece of news do you want to discuss first?" I explained. Everything. Mark's offer, my growing suspicions about James, the hotel charges, the missed dinners, the subtle shifts in how he treated me. "Have you signed Mark's offer yet?" Emma asked. "No. The final paperwork is being prepared." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The announcement is scheduled for the board meeting next week, after the Executive of the Year ceremony. And James knows nothing about this? No, I was going to tell him, but now, I don't know. Emma was quiet for a moment. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something. I've heard rumors about James and Alyssa Diaz for months. I didn't want to say anything without proof, especially with how dismissive James can be when confronted with things he doesn't want to hear." My throat tightened. "You should have told me." "Would you have believed me over him?" Emma's question hung in the air, and we both knew the answer. The question now is, what do you want to do about it? The next evening, I told James I was visiting my mother for the weekend and checked into the Archer Hotel myself, requesting a room with a view of the entrance to the hotel restaurant. Saturday night, at precisely 7:30 p.m., I watched James arrive, dressed impeccably in a suit I had helped him select last Christmas. 15 minutes later, Alyssa Diaz joined him, tall, confident, 10 years younger than me, and looking at James with unmistakable intimacy as he pulled out her chair. I took pictures with my phone, then ordered room service and watched them through the evening. They laughed, they leaned close, they shared dessert. When they eventually left together and headed toward the elevators, I had all the confirmation I needed. I spent that night re-examining every aspect of my marriage and career. The patterns were clear once I allowed myself to see them. James hadn't just been neglecting our relationship, he had been systematically leveraging my skills, connections, and support while positioning himself to advance alone. The countless times I'd helped him prepare presentations, the introductions, I'd made that became his networking opportunities, the strategies I'd developed that he presented as his own. All of it formed a pattern of calculated exploitation rather than partnership. The next morning, I called Mark Reynolds. "I'm ready to sign," I told him, "and I'd like to accelerate the timeline if possible." "Something change?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew more than he let on. "Let's just say I've gained clarity on some important matters." Mark chuckled. "I'll have the paperwork ready tomorrow. The board announcement will still happen after the award ceremony is planned. That can't be moved due to regulatory filing requirements." "But you'll be the owner before then? Does James know yet?" "No," I replied, "and I'd prefer to keep it that way until the announcement." The following week passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings with financial advisors, and careful planning. I maintained a perfect facade at home, playing the role of supportive wife while James prepared for his big moment at the Executive of the Year ceremony. He had been nominated by the Houston Business Association for his work on the Westfield Partnership, work that, ironically, I had substantially contributed to in its early stages before Alyssa became involved. This award could be the final push I need for the VP position, James told me as he tried on different ties for the event. "Thomas is retiring in 2 years, and this puts me in the running for his job. I smiled and suggested the blue tie that brought out his eyes. You should definitely dress like a future CEO, I said, and he beamed at me, completely missing the edge in my voice. The night of the ceremony arrived, and James was in his element, working the room, shaking hands, introducing me dismissively as my wife Rebecca, when necessary, before steering conversations back to himself. I played my part, smiling graciously, making small talk and pretending not to notice how his hand lingered on Alyssa's back when they spoke across the room. Emma arrived halfway through the cocktail hour, resplendent in a red dress that turned heads. "Everything ready?" she whispered as we hugged in greeting. "All signed and official as of this morning," I confirmed. "And you?" "The press release is drafted and will go out immediately after the board announcement tomorrow. I also took the liberty of having a gift delivered to your table." She nodded toward our assigned seats, where a small, elegantly wrapped package now sat at James's place. "Perfect timing," I said as the lights dimmed, signaling guests to take their seats for dinner and the awards presentation. Through the 3-course meal and preliminary awards, James grew increasingly animated, checking and rechecking his acceptance speech notes. I studied him across the table. This man I had loved, supported, and believed in for 15 years. He looked exactly the same as the day I'd met him, yet completely unfamiliar in the ways that mattered most. When they finally announced James Foster, Reynolds Tech, Executive of the Year, he squeezed my shoulder briefly before bounding to the stage, all white teeth and confident stride. The spotlight found him as he adjusted the microphone. "What an honor," he began, launching into clearly rehearsed humility. He thanked Thomas the CEO, Mark Reynolds the founder, his team, even his college professors. Then came the moment, the one that crystallized everything. "And I should probably acknowledge my wife Rebecca, who's here somewhere," he said, gesturing vaguely toward our table without actually making eye contact. "She's always been supportive. Just his wife, an afterthought, a footnote." Emma's hand found mine under the table as James continued his speech, oblivious to the change that had settled over me. When he returned to the table, flushed with triumph, and accepting congratulations from neighboring diners, I pushed the small package toward him. "A gift," I said, "from me, for all your hard work." James looked surprised but pleased as he tore open the wrapping. Inside was a small velvet box, similar to what might hold cufflinks or a tie pin. But when he opened it, there was only a USB drive and a note in my handwriting. "For your review, Archer Hotel security footage, dates highlighted on the attached calendar." His face drained of color as he looked up at me, then quickly closed the box. "Rebecca, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I replied calmly. "You're very good at explaining things to suit your purposes. But save it for tomorrow's board meeting. I hear there's going to be a big announcement." James's expression shifted from panic to confusion. "What board meeting? What announcement? Oh, did I forget to mention it? Just like you forgot to mention Alyssa? Or the hotel rooms? Or how my strategy for the Westfield deal somehow became your innovative approach?" I kept my voice low, control replacing the hurt I'd carried for weeks. "The board is announcing the new majority shareholder of Reynolds Tech tomorrow morning." James looked completely baffled now. "New majority? But Mark hasn't said anything about selling his shares." "Not to you, no." I smiled pleasantly as a photographer approached our table, asking for a picture of the award winner and his wife. We posed, James's arms stiff around my shoulders, his face struggling to maintain its camera-ready smile. When the photographer moved on, James leaned close, his voice tight. "What have you done, Rebecca?" "I've finally recognized my own value," I replied simply. "Something you forgot to do long ago." Later that night, while James paced our bedroom firing off frantic texts to colleagues, I calmly packed a small, overnight bag. "Where are you going?" he demanded as I headed for the door. We need to talk about this. I'm staying at Emma's tonight. I need to be well rested for my first day as your boss. The look of stunned comprehension on his face was worth every moment of hurt he'd caused me. Oh, and James? The locks will be changed tomorrow while we're at the board meeting. I'll be keeping the house, considering I paid for most of it. You might want to check if the Archer has any long-term rates. At the board meeting the next morning, I sat quietly beside Mark Reynolds as Thomas, the CEO, called the meeting to order. James arrived last, looking haggard and wild-eyed, his gaze darting between me and Mark as he took his seat. Before we begin regular business, Thomas announced, Mark has an important announcement regarding the ownership structure of Reynolds Tech. Mark stood, commanding the room with his presence despite his age. As most of you know, I've been considering succession planning for some time. Today, I'm pleased to announce that I have sold controlling interest in Reynolds Tech. A murmur ran through the room. The new majority shareholder is someone who has contributed enormously to this company's success, often without due recognition. James straightened in his chair, a flicker of desperate hope crossing his face. Mark's next words extinguished it completely. Rebecca Foster is now the largest individual shareholder of Reynolds Tech, with effective controlling interest. The room erupted in surprised conversation as all eyes turned to me. I rose to stand beside Mark, accepting congratulatory handshakes from board members, while James sat frozen in his chair. Rebecca has my complete confidence, Mark continued once the room quieted. She has demonstrated exceptional business acumen, strategic vision, and integrity throughout her career at Reynolds. I look forward to watching the company thrive under her guidance. When I finally addressed the board, my voice was steady and clear. Thank you, Mark, for your trust and confidence. Reynolds Tech has been my professional home for 15 years, and I'm committed to building on the strong foundation Mark has established. I looked directly at James as I continued. I believe in recognizing true contribution and value, wherever it may be found in our organization. In the coming weeks, I'll be conducting a comprehensive review of our executive leadership structure to ensure we have the right people in the right roles. The implication wasn't lost on anyone in the room, least of all James, who sat staring at the table before him, his Executive of the Year award now a hollow victory. After the meeting, as board members filed out with mixed expressions of surprise and curiosity, James approached me, his composure partially restored. You've made your point, Rebecca, he said quietly. We need to talk about this, about us, privately. There is no us to discuss anymore, James. Not personally, at least. Professionally, you report to Thomas, who reports to the board, which I now effectively control. I gathered my papers, maintaining the professional demeanor I'd perfected, over years of being underestimated. Oh, and I've scheduled a performance review of the Westfield account for next week. I'd like Alyssa to present directly to me about her contributions. The color drained from his face again. You can't do this. Actually, I can. That's what controlling interest means. I smiled, not unkindly. You always said I was the brains behind our partnership, James. You just never imagined I'd figure out I didn't need you. As I walked away, Emma fell into step beside me, handing me a coffee and a tablet displaying the business news headlines. Already, the announcement was making waves. Reynolds Tech announces surprise. Leadership change. Founder sells controlling interest to longtime strategy executive. How does it feel? Emma asked as we stepped into the elevator. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in years, like I've finally stopped playing a supporting role in someone else's story. That night, alone in the house that had once been ours but would now truly be mine, I poured myself a glass of champagne and sat in my home office, the smallest room in the house, which James had grudgingly allowed me when we moved in. Tomorrow, I would begin renovations, claiming the spacious den James had used exclusively. I would reshape this home just as I would reshape the company, recognizing value, eliminating what no longer served a purpose, and building something stronger in its place. My phone chimed with a text from Emma. "Saw the news coverage. You're trending on LinkedIn. How's our boy James taking it?" I smiled as I typed my response. Last I heard, he's desperately trying to explain to Alyssa why her performance review has been moved up. Apparently, she's not thrilled about the spotlight on their partnership. The next day, I arrived at Reynolds Tech headquarters earlier than usual. The security guard, who had always greeted James by name but often overlooked me, did a double take as I approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Foster," he said with new deference in his voice. "Ms. Foster," I corrected gently. "And good morning, Richard. Beautiful day, isn't it?" As I stepped off the elevator on the executive floor, where James had an office but I never had, heads turned and conversations paused. I nodded pleasantly as I made my way to what had been Mark's office and was now mine. Melissa, James's assistant, intercepted me in the hallway. "Ms. Foster," she began nervously. "Mr. Foster asked me to schedule some time with you today. He said it's urgent." "I'm sure he did," I replied. "Please tell him my calendar is full today, but HR should be reaching out to schedule his preliminary performance review next week." Melissa's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, ma'am." Inside my new office, I took a moment to absorb the reality of what I had accomplished. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Houston, the morning sun, illuminating a city full of possibilities. On the desk sat a small potted orchid with a note from Mark. "To new beginnings." New beginnings indeed. I had spent 15 years being just James Foster's wife. Today was the first day of being entirely Rebecca Foster, on my own terms, in my own right, following my own vision. I spent my first week as majority owner of Reynolds Tech, observing, listening, and planning. Each morning, I arrived before most of the executive team, reviewing files and reports that gave me a comprehensive picture of the company I now controlled. The reactions to my new position varied wildly throughout the organization. Some employees, particularly women and younger staff members, approached me with congratulations and barely concealed excitement. Others, especially those in James's inner circle, regarded me with thinly veiled suspicion or resentment. Thomas Carlton, our CEO, had requested a private meeting on my second day. He was a competent leader who had guided Reynolds through steady growth for the past 8 years, but lacked the innovative vision that had made Mark Reynolds a legend in the industry. "I wanted to assure you of my complete support during this transition," Thomas said as we sat in my newly redecorated office. The hunting prints and leather furniture that Mark had favored had been replaced with contemporary art and cleaner, more modern pieces. "Mark spoke highly of your strategic abilities." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, studying his carefully neutral expression. "I value your experience and institutional knowledge. I'm not planning any immediate executive changes." The subtle relaxation in his shoulders told me I'd addressed his primary concern. "However, I do want to review our innovation pipeline and strategic partnerships. I believe we've become somewhat complacent in certain areas." Thomas nodded. "Of course. Whatever information you need." He hesitated before adding, "If I may speak frankly, there are concerns about potential conflicts of interest regarding James's position." "I appreciate your candor," I said. "Rest assured, any decisions regarding personnel will be made based on performance metrics and business needs. James will be evaluated by the same standards as everyone else." I smiled slightly. "I've always been a professional above all else, Thomas. That won't change now." What I didn't mention was that I had already begun a detailed audit of the Westfield partnership, James's crowning achievement, and the basis for his Executive of the Year award. Emma's law firm had provided an independent consultant to review all communication, meeting notes, and financial projections associated with the deal. I suspected what we would find, but I needed evidence beyond my own knowledge of how James operated. James himself had adopted a strategy of formal politeness in the office, combined with desperate attempts to speak with me privately. He had moved temporarily into a downtown hotel, not the Archer, I noted with grim amusement, and bombarded me with texts alternating between apologies, accusations, and pleas to be reasonable. 3 days after the board announcement, he cornered me in the parking garage as I was leaving for the day. "This has gone far enough, Rebecca," he said, stepping out from behind a concrete pillar. "You've made your point. You're hurt and angry, and I understand that. But using the company for personal revenge is unprofessional and beneath you." I kept my car keys in my hand, maintaining distance between us. "Is that what you think this is? Revenge? What else would you call it? You went behind my back, made a deal with Mark without even telling me, and now you're threatening my position and professional reputation." His handsome face wore the expression of wounded dignity that had swayed me so many times before. "We need to separate our marital issues from business." That's interesting advice coming from someone who mixed business and pleasure quite thoroughly with Alyssa Diaz, I replied calmly. "But this isn't about revenge, James. It's about recognizing value and contribution, something you should understand better than most, given how frequently you've claimed credit for other people's work." His expression hardened. "That's not fair. Isn't it? I have 15 years of evidence suggesting otherwise. But as I said, this isn't personal." I stepped around him toward my car. "If your work stands on its own merit, you have nothing to worry about from the Westfield Review." "Rebecca," he called as I opened my car door. "I did love you. I still do, in my way. We built a life together. Does that count for nothing?" I paused, remembering the young, ambitious couple we'd once been, planning our future over cheap wine and takeout. It counted for everything, James. That's why it hurt so much when I realized it was one-sided. I met his eyes directly. "But that's a separate conversation from what happens at Reynolds. I meant what I told Thomas. I'm a professional first. I suggest you focus on being one too." The following day, Emma called to tell me the Westfield audit had uncovered significant irregularities. "The original strategy documents have your digital signature," she explained, "but someone removed your name from the presentation materials given to the executive team. The financial projections were also altered to appear more favorable than your initial analysis indicated." "James," I said, not really surprised. He always thought I was too conservative in my revenue forecasts. "Actually, the document properties show Alyssa Diaz made those changes," Emma replied. "But yes, almost certainly at James's direction. There's more. The contract terms were modified after legal review. Certain protection clauses were weakened in ways that significantly favor Westfield." I felt a chill. That could expose us to serious liability. Exactly. And the changes were authorized by James, bypassing standard protocols for contract modifications. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing this new betrayal. James hadn't just been taking credit for my work. He'd been actively undermining it, potentially putting the company at risk to enhance his own reputation as a dealmaker. "Send everything to my secure email," I instructed Emma, "and prepare a full briefing for the executive committee meeting tomorrow." That night, I worked late in my new home office, formerly James's den, reviewing the audit materials and preparing my presentation. At midnight, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Hello, Rebecca." The voice belonged to Alyssa. "Diaz, I think we need to talk." I fought the urge to hang up immediately. "About what exactly?" "About James, about Westfield, about what you think you know." Her voice was steady, but I detected an undercurrent of anxiety. "I know enough, Alyssa. The audit is quite thorough. That's why I'm calling. Before you present tomorrow, you should hear my side of the story." My instinct was to refuse, to tell her that facts spoke for themselves. But my recent experiences had taught me the value of gathering all available information before making decisions. 30 minutes, I said. The coffee shop at the corner of Main and Preston. Bring any documentation you think I should see. When I arrived at the nearly empty coffee shop, Alyssa was already seated in a corner booth, a manila folder on the table before her. She was as polished as ever, but shadows under her eyes betrayed her stress. "Thank you for meeting me," she began as I sat across from her. "I know how this looks. Like you had an affair with my husband while helping him take credit for my work and potentially compromising the company's interests." "Yes, it looks exactly like that." She flinched, but didn't look away. The affair was real. I won't deny that or make excuses, but the rest isn't what you think. She pushed the folder toward me. "James told me the strategy was his. He said you had signed off as part of routine documentation but weren't involved in development. When I suggested improvements to the financial projections, he encouraged me, said it showed initiative." I opened the folder to find emails, text messages, and meeting notes documenting a pattern of manipulation that felt painfully familiar. James positioning himself as Alyssa's mentor and champion while using her ambition to serve his purposes. "When did you realize?" I asked, looking up from the documents. "About 2 months ago. I overheard him on the phone with Thomas taking credit for an analysis I had prepared. It made me wonder what else he might be misrepresenting." She looked down at her hands. "I started keeping better records after that." "And the contract modifications?" "That was James's idea. He said the legal department was being overly cautious, that the changes would make the deal more attractive to Westfield while presenting minimal risk to Reynolds." She met my eyes. "I should have questioned it more, but he was very persuasive about how it would advance both our careers." I believed her. Not because I trusted her, but because her experience mirrored my own in so many ways. James had always been skilled at making people feel special, valued, and understood, right until the moment their usefulness to him changed. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Self-preservation, partly," she admitted, "but also because it's the right thing to do. Reynolds is a good company with good people. It shouldn't be damaged by one man's ego and ambition." I studied her for a moment. "What do you want in return?" "A fair evaluation, a chance to demonstrate my actual capabilities without James's influence." She paused. "And I want to help fix the Westfield contract. I have ideas for amendments that could protect Reynolds while maintaining the partnership." I gathered the documents and stood. "I'll review these before tomorrow's meeting. I can't promise anything beyond that." "I understand." Alyssa remained, seated. "Rebecca, for what it's worth, he talked about you. Said you were brilliant but too cautious. Too content to work behind the scenes." A sad smile touched her lips. "I think he was terrified of being outshone by you." Walking to my car, I realized I felt no anger toward Alyssa, only a weary recognition that she, like me, had been manipulated by a man who viewed relationships primarily as transactions. The difference was, I had escaped the cycle, and now I had the power to ensure justice was served. The executive committee meeting the next morning was tense. 8 senior leaders sat around the conference room table, with Thomas at one end and me at the other. James arrived last, taking the only remaining seat directly across from Alyssa, who studiously avoided his gaze. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "As you know, I've initiated a review of several key strategic initiatives, beginning with the Westfield partnership. What I've discovered raises serious concerns that I believe require immediate attention." For the next 20 minutes, I presented the findings of the audit, including the unauthorized contract modifications, the altered financial projections, and the deliberate removal of attribution from strategic documents. I didn't mention James or Alyssa by name, focusing instead on the integrity of our processes. and the potential risks to the company. These discrepancies aren't just administrative oversights, I concluded. They represent a systematic attempt to circumvent our established protocols and potentially expose Reynolds to significant liability. I'm proposing immediate remediations, including amendments to the Westfield contract and a restructuring of how strategic partnerships are developed and approved. Thomas spoke first. These are disturbing findings, Rebecca. What's your recommendation regarding personnel? I felt all eyes shift between James, Alyssa, and me, everyone aware of the personal dimension but uncertain how it would affect my decision. I believe in second chances, I said carefully, and in allowing people to demonstrate their true capabilities when freed from negative influences. I looked directly at James. However, I also believe in accountability. Those responsible for knowingly undermining company interests must face appropriate consequences. James leaned forward, his face flushed. This is absurd. You're cherry-picking evidence to paint me as some kind of corporate villain because of personal issues between us. Do you deny altering the contract terms after legal review? I asked calmly. I made necessary adjustments to secure the deal. That's what business development is about. Calculated risks. Without proper authorization or disclosure, that's not risk management, James. It's deception. Before he could respond, Alyssa spoke up. I have documentation confirming these findings. Her voice was steady as she addressed the room. I was involved in implementing some of these changes at James's direction, which was a serious error, in judgment on my part. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences the committee determines appropriate, but I also want to help correct the situation. James stared at her in disbelief. You're taking her side? After everything I've done? For your career? I'm choosing integrity, Alyssa replied simply. Something I should have done much sooner. The meeting continued with a detailed discussion of remediation steps. By the end, the committee had unanimously approved my proposal to renegotiate key terms of the Westfield contract, implement new approval protocols for strategic partnerships, and initiate a comprehensive review of all deals led by James over the past 3 years. As everyone filed out, I asked James to remain behind. When we were alone, he turned to me with cold fury in his eyes. Congratulations, Rebecca. You've managed to destroy everything I've built in one morning. You did that yourself, James. I simply brought the facts to light. He laughed bitterly. Facts selectively presented to serve your narrative. You've wanted this from the moment Mark offered you control, a chance to humiliate me professionally the way you imagine I humiliated you personally. That's not true, I replied, maintaining my composure. But I understand why you need to believe it. It's easier than acknowledging your own actions. So what happens now? You fire me? Turn me into a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing Rebecca Foster? I studied the man I had once loved enough to sublimate my own ambitions for. Despite everything, I felt a twinge of sadness for what might have been if he had been capable of true partnership. You have 2 options, I said. Resignation with a neutral reference, contingent on your full cooperation with the Westfield remediation, or termination for cause, with all the documentation made available to the board and potentially to regulatory authorities. His face paled. You wouldn't. I don't want to. Despite everything, we shared 15 years, James. I would prefer to end this chapter with as little additional damage as possible. To Reynolds, to you, and to me. But that depends entirely on your choices going forward. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching my face for weakness or hesitation. Finding none, he finally nodded. I'll have my resignation letter to you by end of day. Thank you. I gathered my materials and moved toward the door. For what it's worth, you are talented, James. Your ability to connect with people, to inspire confidence, to envision possibilities, those are real strengths. I just wish you had used them more ethically. Save the exit interview psychology, he said sharply. You won, Rebecca. You don't need to pretend magnanimity. I paused at the door. That's the difference between us, James. I never saw this as a competition to be won or lost. I saw it as a necessary correction, bringing things back into balance and alignment with the truth. I met his eyes one last time. Goodbye, James. Walking back to my office, I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of resolution, like a long dislocated joint finally set back into place. The road ahead would be challenging. Repairing the Westfield partnership, rebuilding trust within the executive team, and reshaping Reynolds' strategic direction would require all my skills and energy. But for the first time in years, I felt fully aligned with my own values and vision. Emma called that afternoon. I heard James resigned, effective immediately, according to the grapevine. News travels fast, I remarked, gazing out my office window at the Houston skyline. It's all anyone can talk about. First you become majority owner, then you expose the golden boy's less than golden deeds. The Reynolds Tech drama is better than any streaming series. She paused. How are you feeling about everything? I considered the question carefully. Lighter, clearer, like I've put down a heavy burden I didn't even realize I was carrying. And Alyssa? Word is she's staying on in a reconfigured role. She has valuable skills and insights, particularly regarding the Westfield relationship. And she had the courage to come forward with the truth, even knowing it might cost her professionally. Very magnanimous of you, Emma observed. I'm not sure I could be so forgiving in your position. It's not about forgiveness, I explained. It's about recognizing patterns and breaking them. James operated by pitting people against each other, creating dependencies and exploiting insecurities. The most powerful rejection of his approach is to build something different, something based on transparency, merit, and genuine collaboration. Rebecca Foster, corporate philosopher, Emma teased. But seriously, I'm proud of you, not just for taking control of Reynolds, but for how you're handling it. You're going to transform that company. That's the plan, I agreed, starting with my home tonight. After leaving the office, I drove to a modest apartment complex where my mother had lived since my father's death 5 years earlier. She opened the door with a knowing smile, already dressed for dinner. I saw the news about James's resignation, she said as we settled into her small living room. Are you okay? Better than okay, I assured her. But I need your help with something. It's time to completely redesign the house. New furniture, new colors, new energy. I was hoping you might lend your expert eye. My mother had been an interior designer before retirement, with an uncanny ability to transform spaces to reflect their inhabitants' true selves. I'd be honored, she said, eyes lighting up. What are you thinking? Something that reflects who I am now, not who I was trying to be for James. Something that feels like coming home to yourself, she finished for me, squeezing my hand. We can do that. Over the next 4 weeks, as I navigated the challenges of restructuring Reynolds Tech's executive team and renegotiating the Westfield contract, my mother and I systematically transformed the house that had once been a showcase for James's success into a reflection of my own essence. The formal living room he had insisted on maintaining for entertaining became a comfortable library filled with books and artwork I loved. The sterile guest bedroom was converted into a yoga and meditation space. His massive bedroom suite was scaled down, the imposing furniture replaced with simpler, more elegant pieces that felt both luxurious and grounded. The most significant change came in the kitchen, the heart of any home. Where James had wanted impressive professional appliances that he never used and cold granite surfaces, I chose warm wood, practical workspaces, and an expansive island where friends could gather while I cooked. The transformation wasn't just aesthetic. It was reclaiming my own preferences, tastes, and way of living that had been gradually compromised over the years. At Reynolds, a similar transformation was underway. With James gone and Thomas announcing his intention to retire within the year, I had the opportunity to reshape the company's culture and strategic direction. I promoted several talented mid-level managers who had been overlooked during James's tenure, including 2 brilliant women who had nearly left the company due to limited advancement opportunities. The Westfield contract was successfully renegotiated, with Alyssa playing a key role in the discussions. Her knowledge of the original deal, combined with her genuine remorse for her part in the problematic terms, made her an effective advocate for correcting course without damaging the partnership. 6 weeks after James's resignation, I invited the executive team to my home for dinner, something I had never done during my marriage. As they arrived, expressions of surprise and appreciation at the transformed space told me they understood the significance of the gesture. "This is who I actually am," the environment said clearly. "Not the person you thought you knew as James's wife." Halfway through the evening, as conversations flowed naturally between business strategies and personal interests, Thomas pulled me aside. "I've been watching you these past weeks," he said quietly. "The way you've handled everything. The Westfield situation, James's departure, the restructuring. It's been impressive. You haven't just seized control. You've created a vision." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by his acknowledgement. "That means a lot coming from you." "I've been thinking about my retirement," he continued. "I was planning to stay through the transition, but honestly, I think the company is already in the right hands." He smiled warmly. "Have you considered taking on the CEO role yourself?" The question caught me off guard. I had been focused on establishing my authority as majority owner, on correcting the immediate issues left in James's wake. The possibility of becoming CEO hadn't fully crystallized in my thinking yet. "I'd want the board's full support," I said carefully, "and yours." "You already have mine," Thomas assured me. "And from what I've observed, the board has seen enough to be convinced of your capabilities. Think about it. We could announce it at the quarterly meeting next month. A clean transition, a clear signal about Reynolds' future direction." Later that night, after my guests had departed, I sat alone in my redesigned living room, considering Thomas's suggestion. Becoming CEO would fundamentally change my role from overseer to daily leader. It would mean deeper involvement in operations, more public representation of the company, and greater scrutiny of my decisions. It would also mean completing the journey from James's supportive wife to the acknowledged leader of the organization, where we had both begun our careers with equal promise but divergent paths. My phone chimed with a text from Emma. "Great dinner. Your house feels like you now. Also, Melissa told me Thomas is pushing for you as CEO. Thoughts?" I smiled, typing back, "Considering it seriously. Would mean a lot more work and visibility." Her response came quickly. "You've been working and invisible for years. Time for the world to see what I've always known was there." The following morning, I arrived at the office early to find Mark Reynolds waiting in my reception area, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Mark, this is unexpected. What brings you in?" He held up the business section, where an article detailed Reynolds Tech's successful renegotiation of the Westfield contract, with analysts praising the company's transparent approach to addressing previously undisclosed risks. "Wanted to congratulate you in person," he said, following me into my office. "You've handled this exactly right, addressing the problems without creating panic or instability." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely pleased by his approval. "It's been challenging, but I believe we're on the right track." Mark settled into a chair, studying me with the keen eyes that had built Reynolds Tech from nothing. "Thomas called me yesterday. Says he's ready to step down, wants you to take over as CEO. He mentioned it to me as well. I'm still considering what's best for the company." And for yourself, Mark added perceptively. Being majority owner gives you power, but being CEO puts you squarely in the spotlight. No more working behind the scenes. I nodded, appreciating his understanding of my hesitation. That's part of it. I've always been more comfortable as the strategist than the public face. Like me, Mark chuckled. I hated the PR aspects of running Reynolds, always preferred solving problems to talking about solving them. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. But sometimes, Rebecca, leadership means stepping out of our comfort zones. Not just for ourselves, but for what it means to others. Others? Do you know why I ultimately decided to sell to you instead of some private equity firm that offered more money? He didn't wait for my answer. Because I watched you for years. Brilliant, hardworking, ethical, being systematically undervalued and overlooked. Not just by James, but by a system that too often mistakes confidence for competence and self-promotion for achievement. I felt a tightness in my throat at his unexpected words. When I built this company, I wanted it to stand for something beyond profit. Mark continued. Excellence, yes, but also integrity and genuine innovation. Seeing it gradually shift toward style over substance under James's influence was disappointing. You never said anything, I observed. Not my place anymore. I'd stepped back, given Thomas in the boardroom to lead. He smiled ruefully. Perhaps that was a mistake. But now there's an opportunity to correct course. You as CEO would send a powerful message, not just about Reynolds' values, but about what true leadership looks like. As Mark left, his words lingered with me. The decision to become CEO wasn't just about my career trajectory or the practical demands of the role. It was about representation, about showing other supportive wives and overlooked contributors that their value could and should be recognized. That afternoon, I called Thomas to accept his proposal. I'd be honored to become CEO when you retire, I told him. But I have some conditions about how we structure the transition and the strategic priorities we emphasize going forward. Thomas laughed good-naturedly. Already negotiating. That's why you're perfect for this, Rebecca. The day before the quarterly board meeting where my CEO appointment would be announced, I received a letter delivered by courier. The return address was a town in Colorado I didn't recognize. Inside was a brief handwritten note from James. Rebecca, I've had time to reflect on everything that happened between us, both personally and professionally. While I'm still working through my feelings about how things ended, I want you to know that I recognize my part in the breakdown of our marriage and my ethical lapses at Reynolds. The company deserves leadership with integrity, and despite our high history, I believe you will provide that. I've moved to Colorado to start fresh, and am seeking therapy to understand the patterns that led me to prioritize advancement over honesty and genuine connection. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that some of your final words to me have resonated more deeply than you might have imagined. Wishing you success in all your endeavors, James. I sat with the letter for a long time, surprised by the complex emotions it stirred. Not longing or regret, but a certain melancholy acknowledgement of all we might have been if James had been capable of this level of self-reflection years earlier. I tucked the letter into my desk drawer without responding. Perhaps someday I would, when the wounds were less fresh and the lessons more fully integrated. The board meeting the next day was a formality. The decision to appoint me as CEO had been unanimously approved in advance. As Thomas made the announcement, I looked around the boardroom at the faces of people who had once known me primarily as James's wife, and now regarded me with genuine respect and, in some cases, a healthy measure of constructive fear. Reynolds Tech stands at a pivotal moment in its evolution, I began my acceptance remarks. The technology landscape is shifting rapidly, and the way we've operated in the past won't guarantee success in the future. We need to be bolder in our innovation, more ethical in our practices, and more inclusive in how we identify and develop talent. I outlined my vision for the company's future, emphasizing genuine partnership with clients, transparent communication with stakeholders, and a culture that valued contribution over presentation. As I spoke, I realized I was describing not just the company I wanted to lead, but the marriage I had deserved, one built on mutual respect, shared success, and authentic recognition. I accept this role with humility and determination, I concluded. Together, we will build on Reynolds' legacy while creating something even stronger for the future. Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner with Emma and my mother, I finally allowed myself to fully absorb the magnitude of the transformation in my life. 6 months ago, I had been just James's wife, an appendage to his success story, a support system for his ambitions. Now, I was Rebecca Foster, CEO and majority owner of Reynolds Tech, living in a home that truly reflected my identity, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and valued me authentically. To new beginnings, Emma toasted, raising her glass. And to recognizing your own worth, my mother added, her eyes bright with pride. I lifted my glass to join them, adding my own silent addendum. And to no longer being just anyone's wife, but fully and completely myself. 2 days later, I stood before the assembled employees of Reynolds Tech for my first company-wide address as CEO. Looking out at the hundreds of faces, some familiar, many not yet known to me, I felt a profound sense of responsibility and possibility. Many of you know me or think you do, I began. But today marks the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. I stand before you not as someone's wife, colleague, or boss, but as a leader committed to building a company where each person's true contribution is recognized and valued, where credit is given where it's due, where innovation emerges from collaboration rather than competition, and where success is measured not just in quarterly results, but in the integrity of our actions and the sustainability of our impact. As I continued outlining my vision for Reynolds' future, I caught sight of Alyssa in the audience, listening intently. Next to her sat Melissa, James's former assistant, who had recently accepted a promotion to project coordinator, a role better suited to her actual capabilities than the administrative position where James had kept her confined. Throughout the room were dozens of others whose talents had been overlooked or underutilized during the previous regime, people who, like me, had been defined more by their relationships to power than by their own inherent value and abilities. Today, we begin writing a new story together, I concluded, one where each of you has the opportunity to be fully seen, heard, and recognized for exactly who you are and what you contribute. I am honored to lead that journey, and I look forward to discovering all that we can accomplish when we truly value each other's gifts. The applause that followed wasn't just for me, it was for the possibility I represented. The hope that in this company, under this leadership, people might finally be free to bring their full, authentic selves to work and be valued accordingly. As I stepped away from the podium, I knew that the path ahead would be challenging. Transforming a corporate culture, especially one shaped by years of different values and priorities, would require persistent effort, strategic patience, and unwavering commitment to principle. But for the first time in years, perhaps ever, I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, as exactly who I was meant to be. No longer just someone's wife, but fully and completely Rebecca Foster, in my own right, on my own terms, following my own vision. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. 3 months into my role as CEO of Reynolds Tech, I found myself facing my first major crisis. A sophisticated cyber attack had targeted our client database, potentially compromising sensitive information from dozens of corporate customers. I had been preparing for a crucial investor presentation when Raj Patel, our Chief Information Security Officer, appeared in my doorway, his normally calm demeanor visibly shaken. "We've detected an intrusion in our main client server," he reported, closing the door behind him. It appears to be a targeted attack, possibly state-sponsored given the sophistication of the code. They were specifically after the Westfield. Integration protocols. I felt a chill. The Westfield partnership had been repaired and strengthened since James's departure, but the integration of our security systems was still in progress. A vulnerability I had flagged in my first week as CEO. "How bad is the breach?" I asked, already clearing my schedule for the day. "We contained it quickly, but not before they accessed some of the architectural diagrams. The good news is we had already implemented the additional security layers you insisted on last month. Without those, this could have been catastrophic." I nodded, silently thanking my own instincts and the expert security team I'd assembled after uncovering the flaws in James's original Westfield contract. "Assemble the crisis response team in the war room. I'll join you in 10 minutes after," I notify the board chair. As Raj left, I stared momentarily at the framed photo on my desk. Not a personal image, but the company-wide photo taken on my first day as CEO, with hundreds of expectant faces looking to me for leadership. Now was the time to prove their trust hadn't been misplaced. The next 72 hours were a blur of emergency meetings, technical briefings, and strategic decisions. I personally called the CEOs of our most affected clients, taking full responsibility for the breach while detailing our response plan. Rather than minimizing the situation, I chose absolute transparency, an approach that initially raised concerns among some board members accustomed to the more controlled messaging of previous administrations. "You're exposing us to potential liability," argued Harold Winters, one of our more conservative directors, during an emergency board call. "Acknowledging the full extent of the breach before we're legally required to disclose it could trigger client departures and stock volatility." "With respect, Harold," I countered, "I believe the greater risk lies in losing trust. Our clients deserve to know exactly what happened, what data was potentially compromised, and what we're doing to prevent future incidents. That level of transparency will ultimately strengthen our relationships, not damage them." I had expected resistance, but I was surprised by the support that came from an unexpected quarter. "Rebecca's approach is correct," said Victoria Zhao, our newest board member, and the CEO of a major telecommunications company. "I've been on both sides of security breaches. The companies that are forthright and take immediate ownership recover client trust far more effectively than those who obfuscate or delay disclosure." By the fourth day, we had fully contained the breach, implemented additional security measures, and communicated comprehensive updates to all stakeholders. The predicted mass client exodus hadn't materialized. In fact, several clients expressed appreciation for our transparent handling of the situation. "Your team's response has actually increased our confidence in Reynolds," the CTO of one of our largest banking clients told me during a follow-up call. "We've dealt with vendors who tried to hide similar breaches until legally forced to disclose them. Your approach demonstrates integrity." As the crisis subsided, I found myself unexpectedly reflecting on James. He would have handled this differently, crafting a careful narrative that emphasized Reynolds' quick response while downplaying the breach itself. He would have been smooth, reassuring, and selectively truthful. And in the short term, it might have even worked better for the stock price. But I wasn't James. My leadership was built on different foundations: transparency, accountability, and a commitment to the long-term health of the company over short-term appearances. The cyber attack had been my first true test as CEO, a moment that defined my leadership style not just for the board and our clients, but for myself. The Sunday following the resolution of the cyber crisis, I finally allowed myself a day off. Emma had insisted on a mandatory relaxation day at her lake house outside the city, claiming I needed perspective that couldn't be found within the walls of my office or home. "You look exhausted but satisfied," she observed as we sat on her deck overlooking the water, wine glasses in hand, and the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lake. The Rebecca Foster CEO emergency management style seems to have been a success. I smiled, feeling the tension of the past week finally begin to ease. It was touch and go for a bit, but yes, I think we handled it the right way. More than handled it, Emma corrected. According to my sources, you've become something of a legend within the industry. CEO personally calls to admit security flaw and outline solution before anyone even knew there was a problem. That's not exactly the corporate playbook most follow. It's the only way I know how to lead, I admitted. If I tried to be someone else, someone more politically calculating, I'd fail. Emma studied me for a moment. You're thinking about James. It wasn't a question. After 15 years of friendship, Emma could read my thoughts almost before I formed them. I can't help comparing how he would have managed this situation, I acknowledged. He would have controlled the narrative, limited disclosure, perhaps even found someone to blame. And you'd have helped him craft that narrative, Emma pointed out. That was the pattern, wasn't it? James created the story, and you provided the substance behind it. Her observation struck deeper than I expected. For years, I had enabled James's approach, refining his presentations, strengthening his proposals, quietly fixing problems he created while allowing him to take credit for the solutions. I had been complicit in the very system that had undervalued me. I did, I admitted, because I believed in the partnership even when it wasn't equal. I thought supporting his success was an investment in our shared future. And now? I gazed out at the lake, watching a heron glide gracefully across the water before answering. Now I understand that true partnership doesn't require one person to diminish themselves for the other to shine. At Reynolds, I'm trying to build a culture where everyone's contributions are recognized and valued, including my own. Emma raised her glass. To recognizing your own value, finally. And to partnerships based on mutual respect, I added, thinking not just of my failed marriage, but of the new relationships I was building at Reynolds, with my executive team, with clients, with the board, relationships founded on authenticity rather than appearance. Later that evening, as we prepared dinner in Emma's kitchen, my phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, having promised Emma a work-free day, but something made me answer. Is this Rebecca Foster? A woman's voice asked. Yes, who's calling? My name is Claire Bennett. I was James's girlfriend in college before you. I nearly dropped the phone, catching Emma's curious glance as my expression changed. I see. What can I do for you, Claire? I've been following your story. Your takeover of Reynolds, becoming CEO, even the way you handled the security breach this week. It's been illuminating to see you emerge from James's shadow. I moved to the deck for privacy, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Thank you, but I'm still not sure why you're calling after all these years. Claire was silent for a moment before continuing. I saw a pattern in your story that felt familiar, too familiar. The way James took credit for your work, the gradual erosion of your professional identity, the affairs. Her voice trailed off. He did the same to me in college. We were lab partners in organic chemistry. I was the better student, but somehow he always presented our work, got the recognition. He started dating our teaching assistant while we were still together. When I confronted him, he made me feel crazy for questioning him. I sank into a deck chair, a strange sense of validation washing over me. This wasn't just my story. It was a pattern that predated me, that would likely have continued with Alyssa or someone else if circumstances hadn't forced a reckoning. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because for years I thought it was just me, that I wasn't. Assertive enough that I should have spoken up sooner. Seeing your story made me realize it was never about my deficiencies. It was his pattern. She paused. And because I wanted you to know that what you're doing now matters beyond Reynolds Tech. It matters to women like me who recognize themselves in your story. After we disconnected, I sat staring at the darkening lake, processing the unexpected connection to a woman I'd never met, but with whom I shared a formative experience. Claire's call had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the past 15 years. What I had experienced with James wasn't unique or personal. It was systemic, a repeating pattern that would have continued regardless of who occupied the role of his wife. When I rejoined Emma in the kitchen, she took one look at my face and asked, "Bad news?" "Actually, no," I replied, surprised to realize it was true. "Clarifying news. That was James's college girlfriend calling to tell me he did the same things to her 20 years ago that he did to me." Emma raised an eyebrow. "And this is good news because it confirms it was never about me, my shortcomings, my choices, my failure to somehow manage him better. It was always his pattern, one he established long before we met." I picked up the knife and resumed chopping vegetables with renewed energy. "It's strangely liberating." "Freedom through pattern recognition," Emma nodded. "Very on brand for you." We laughed, and the evening continued with lighter conversation, but Claire's call had planted a seed that would grow into something significant in the coming months. Back at Reynolds on Monday morning, I found myself viewing our organizational dynamics with fresh eyes. In meetings, I began noticing subtle patterns: who spoke and who was spoken over, whose ideas were acknowledged and whose were later repeated by others who received the credit. I recognized these dynamics not just because I had experienced them personally, but because I had now seen them as part of a larger systemic issue that extended beyond my individual story. During our weekly executive team meeting, I watched as Daniel Meyer, our chief marketing officer, restated an idea that Monica Reyes, our director of product development, had introduced moments earlier. What was striking wasn't just the repetition, but how the team's attention shifted. Monica's original suggestion had received minimal response, while Daniel's repackaging of it generated enthusiastic discussion. Before we move forward with Daniel's suggestion, I interjected, "I'd like to return to the original concept that Monica introduced. Monica, could you elaborate on how you envision this implementation?" The momentary confusion on Daniel's face quickly gave way to embarrassment as he realized what had happened. Monica, looking surprised but grateful, outlined her vision in greater detail. By the end of the meeting, it was clear in the minutes and action items that this was Monica's strategic initiative, with Daniel listed as supporting resource rather than originator. It was a small correction, but judging from the appreciative glance Monica gave me as we adjourned, a meaningful one. That afternoon, I asked my assistant to schedule a company-wide voluntary session on recognition equity in the workplace for the following month. "What exactly is recognition equity?" she asked, pen poised over her notebook. "It's the principle that people should receive acknowledgement proportional to their actual contributions, regardless of their position, gender, background, or presentation style," I explained. "It's about creating systems that ensure credit goes where it's genuinely deserved." The initiative might have remained an internal professional development program if not for a call I received 2 weeks later from Lisa Grant, editor-in-chief of Women in Business magazine. "We'd like to feature you in our annual Transformational Leaders issue," she explained. "Your story, from being dismissed as just a wife to becoming CEO of the company where your husband once worked, has resonated strongly with our readers. But we're equally interested in how you're transforming Reynolds Tech's culture." I hesitated, uncomfortable with the notion of using my personal experience for publicity. I appreciate the interest, but I've been reluctant to focus on the personal aspects of my journey. The company's success should be the story, not my marriage. "With respect, Ms. Foster, they're inseparable," Lisa replied frankly. "Your personal experience directly informed the leadership principles you're now implementing at Reynolds. That connection is precisely what makes your approach to corporate culture so compelling." She had a point. My emphasis on transparent communication, recognition equity, and collaborative achievement all stemmed directly from what I had experienced and enabled in my relationship with James. By compartmentalizing my personal history, I was potentially limiting the impact of the lessons learned. What if, I suggested after a moment's reflection, we broadened the focus? Not just my story, but a larger examination of recognition equity in corporate environments? I could share my experience as one example among many of how contribution and credit often become misaligned. Lisa's enthusiasm was immediate. Even better, we could include perspectives from other executives, research on the impact of recognition disparities, and practical strategies for creating more equitable systems. Your personal story provides the narrative thread, but the piece becomes a resource rather than just a profile. The resulting article, The Recognition Gap: How CEO Rebecca Foster is Transforming Corporate Culture Through Equitable Credit, was published 2 months later. It included not only elements of my experience with James, but perspectives from other executives, including both Monica and Daniel from Reynolds, who candidly discussed the meeting where I had redirected credit back to Monica. The piece also highlighted research showing that recognition disparities disproportionately affected women and minorities, with significant impacts on advancement opportunities, compensation, and retention. Most importantly, it outlined practical strategies for identifying and correcting these patterns at both individual and organizational levels. I had expected some industry attention, but I was unprepared for the overwhelming response. The article was shared thousands of times across professional platforms. I received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own experiences with credit appropriation and recognition disparities. Business schools requested permission to use the article in leadership ethics courses. Most surprisingly, several prominent CEOs publicly committed to implementing recognition equity initiatives in their own organizations. "You've struck a nerve," Emma observed over lunch, scrolling through responses to the article on her phone. Apparently, being just someone's wife is a universal experience that transcends actual matrimony. "It's not just about gender," I pointed out. "It's about power dynamics and how certain voices are privileged over others regardless of actual contribution. The patterns affect everyone, even if some groups experience them more intensely." True, but your particular story, from overlooked wife to CEO revealing the man behind the curtain, has a certain poetic justice that people find deeply satisfying. Emma grinned. "Speaking of which, have you heard from James since the article came out?" I shook my head. "Not directly, but his sister Caroline called yesterday." "Caroline? You haven't spoken to her in what, a year?" "Longer. Not since James moved out." I stirred my iced tea, remembering the unexpected conversation. "She said she wanted me to know that their parents finally read the article. Apparently, it led to some uncomfortable family discussions about patterns they had enabled throughout James's life." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Interesting that she felt compelled to tell you that." She also mentioned that James is engaged again to a software engineer at his new company in Colorado. Caroline said she gave the woman a subscription to Women in Business. We both laughed at that, though I felt a complicated pang of emotion for this unknown woman. Not jealousy, those feelings had long since dissolved, but a sense of connection to someone unwittingly stepping into a role I had finally managed to transcend. "Do you think he's changed?" Emma asked, suddenly serious. "I don't know," I admitted. "The letter he sent before I became CEO suggested some self-reflection, but patterns that deep-seated don't transform overnight. I hope for her sake that therapy has helped him recognize his behaviors." "And for your sake?" Emma pressed gently. I considered the question carefully. "For my sake, it doesn't actually matter anymore whether James changes or not. My growth isn't dependent on his. That's perhaps the most important thing I've learned through all of this. My value exists independently of his recognition or lack thereof." The Recognition Equity Initiative at Reynolds Tech expanded far beyond the original voluntary training session I had envisioned. What began as a single workshop evolved into a comprehensive program that included structured feedback processes, modifications to our performance review systems, and even changes to how we conducted meetings to ensure all voices were heard. We implemented a simple but effective practice during brainstorming sessions. Ideas were recorded on a shared screen, with original contributors' names attached, making it harder for concepts to be appropriated without acknowledgement. Performance reviews were restructured to include peer feedback about collaboration and credit sharing. Project retrospectives specifically identified individual contributions to successful outcomes. The changes weren't just philosophical, they yielded measurable results. Employee satisfaction scores rose, particularly among groups that had historically reported feeling undervalued. Retention improved, especially among women in technical roles where we had previously struggled. Most significantly, innovation metrics increased as people became more willing to share ideas when they trusted they would receive appropriate recognition. 6 months after the Women in Business article, I received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at the National Women's Leadership Conference. The suggested topic was, "From Supporting Role to Center Stage, Reclaiming Your Professional Identity." I sat with the invitation for several days, uncertain whether to accept. While I had become more comfortable discussing the personal aspects of my journey in service of larger principles, I remained wary of becoming defined by my relationship to James rather than by my leadership of Reynolds Tech. I called my mother for perspective. At 73, she had navigated her own professional journey as one of the few female architects in her firm during the 1970s and 80s, facing recognition disparities that made my experiences seem modest by comparison. "I understand your hesitation," she said after I explained my concerns. "No one wants to be perpetually introduced as the woman whose husband undermined her career. But consider this. Your story has already helped countless people recognize patterns in their own professional relationships. The conference gives you an opportunity to shift the narrative from what was done to you to what you've created as a result." Her framing resonated deeply. This wasn't about relitigating the past or dwelling on James's behavior. It was about extracting meaningful lessons from that experience and translating them into principles that could help others forge their own paths to recognition and leadership. I accepted the invitation with one condition: that the conference also include a panel discussion featuring other executives who had implemented recognition equity initiatives, ensuring the focus remained on systemic change rather than personal drama. As I worked on my keynote address in the weeks leading up to the conference, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly my perspective had evolved since that moment at the Executive of the Year ceremony, when James had referred to me as just my wife. What had initially felt like a personal humiliation had revealed itself as a symptom of broader patterns that affected countless professionals. My individual story of reclaiming my value had expanded into a movement for systemic change that extended far beyond my experience with James. The day before the conference, I received an unexpected email from Alyssa Diaz, who had left Reynolds 6 months earlier to lead product development at a promising startup. "I wanted to thank you before your keynote tomorrow," she wrote. "Not just for how you treated me during a difficult time at Reynolds, but for what you taught me about recognizing my own value." When James brought me into the Westfield project, I was flattered by his attention and praise. I didn't question why my name wasn't on presentations or why my analyses were presented as his insights. I accepted the narrative that his promotion of my work was how the game was played. Her message continued. "Working under your leadership showed me a different model, one where contribution and recognition are properly aligned. In my new role, I've implemented many of the recognition equity practices you pioneered at Reynolds. Our founder recently commented that our team has unusually low ego and unusually high output compared to other startups he's worked with. That's your influence at work." Alyssa's email crystallized something important. The most meaningful validation of my leadership wasn't the magazine features or speaking invitations, but how the principles I championed were being carried forward by others who had experienced their value firsthand. I arrived at the conference center early, wanting time to acclimate to the space before my keynote. The main hall was still being prepared, chairs arranged in neat rows facing the stage where I would soon share the most challenging and transformative chapter of my professional life. "Ms. Foster?" A young woman approached, clipboard in hand. "I'm Maya Johnson, the conference coordinator. Is there anything you need before your session?" I smiled, recognizing the slight nervousness in her manner that I had often felt early in my career when approaching senior executives. "Just a few minutes of quiet to review my notes, Maya. But first, tell me about your role here. Have you been with the conference long?" Her surprise at being asked about herself was telling. Another small example of how those in supporting roles often remain invisible unless they actively seek recognition. As she described her responsibilities coordinating sessions and managing speakers, I noted the strategic thinking behind her approach to scheduling complementary topics. "That's impressive planning," I commented. "Have you shared those insights with the conference leadership? That kind of strategic programming adds significant value." Maya looked momentarily taken aback. No, I haven't. It's just part of doing my job well." "Consider documenting your approach and sharing it," I suggested. "Recognition begins with making your contributions visible, especially the strategic elements that might otherwise be seen as merely operational." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'll do that. Thank you." Pausing, she added, "I'm really looking forward to your keynote. The article you wrote changed how I think about my own work." After Maya left, I found a quiet corner to review my notes, though the outline of my speech was by now firmly embedded in my memory. I had structured it around 3 key transformations, from supporting role to leadership, from enabling imbalance to creating equity, and from personal vindication to systemic change. As I waited for my introduction, I thought about how far I had come from that moment in the ballroom when James's casual dismissal had crystallized years of accumulated inequity. The journey from just his wife to CEO had been about much more than professional advancement or personal revenge. It had been about recognizing patterns, breaking cycles, and creating new models for how contribution and recognition could and should align. When the conference chair introduced me to enthusiastic applause, I approached the podium with a sense of purpose that transcended my individual story. Yes, I would share my experience of betrayal and reclamation, but more importantly, I would translate those personal lessons into principles that could help others recognize and reform the patterns in their own lives and organizations. "Thank you for that kind introduction," I began, looking out at the sea of faces, predominantly but not exclusively female, spanning generations and industries. Many of you know elements of my story, how I went from being dismissed as just my husband's wife at an award ceremony to becoming CEO of the company where we both worked. It's a narrative that has elements of personal vindication that many find satisfying. I paused, making eye contact with audience members in different sections of the hall. But if that were the entire point, my individual journey from overlooked spouse to empowered executive, it would be merely an anecdote, not a catalyst for change. The true significance lies not in what happened to me, but in what it revealed about patterns that affect all of us, regardless of gender, position, or industry. As I continued into the body of my speech, I could see heads nodding in recognition, people leaning forward in their seats, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the principles I was sharing about recognition equity, transparent communication, and systems that align contribution with credit. "The most powerful question we can ask ourselves," I said as I approached my conclusion, "is not, who has failed to recognize my value, but rather, what systems am I participating in, perhaps unknowingly, that perpetuate recognition disparities, for myself and others?" When we shift from seeking individual validation to creating equitable systems, we transform not just our own experience, but the environments in which we all work. The standing ovation that followed my closing remarks was gratifying, but what meant even more were the conversations that unfolded over the remainder of the conference. Executives sharing how they had begun implementing recognition equity practices in their organizations. Emerging leaders describing how they had found their voices in environments that had previously marginalized them, and perhaps most meaningfully, several men discussing how they had recognized and begun to address their own unconscious patterns of credit appropriation. On the flight home, I reread the notes for a board presentation I was preparing on Reynolds Tech's 3-year strategic plan. The company had thrived under the cultural changes we had implemented, with innovation metrics, client satisfaction, and employee retention all showing significant improvements. The financial results had followed, with our stock price up 32% since I had become CEO. As I reviewed the data, I realized that the most profound measure of success wasn't captured in these metrics. It was in the intangible but essential shift, in how value was recognized and rewarded throughout the organization. A transformation that had begun with my personal reclamation, but had evolved into something far more significant than my individual journey, from overlooked wife to acknowledged leader. My phone chimed with a text from Emma. Saw clips from your keynote online. Standing O, well deserved. Changing systems, not just seeking validation. That's the Rebecca Foster I've always known was there. I smiled, typing back, evolution, not revenge. Turns out that's much more satisfying in the long run. And it was true. The journey that had begun with James's dismissive words at that awards ceremony had transformed into something I couldn't have imagined then. Not just my own reclamation of value, but a movement to create environments where everyone's contributions could be seen, acknowledged, and properly rewarded. Being just his wife had never been the truth of who I was. But that moment of diminishment had ultimately led to expansion, not just for me, but for all those whose stories of overlooked contribution resonated with the principles of recognition, equity we were now advancing together. As the plane began its descent into Houston, I gazed out at the city lights below, thinking about the next phase of this journey. The work of creating truly equitable recognition systems was far from complete, but the patterns had been named, the principles established, and the movement was growing beyond what any single leader, even one who had lived the journey from dismissal to empowerment, could contain. And in that realization was perhaps the most important lesson of all. True leadership isn't about being the sole voice that demands recognition, but about creating spaces where all voices can be heard and valued for exactly what they contribute. No more, no less, and without qualification or diminishment. No one would ever again be just anything in the organizations we were building together. And that, I reflected as the wheels touched down, was a transformation worth every step of the challenging journey that had brought us here. 2 years into my tenure as CEO of Reynolds Tech, I found myself in an unexpected position, considering a merger proposal from Axiom Systems, our largest competitor. Nathaniel Chen, Axiom's founder and CEO, had requested a private meeting, arriving at my office with minimal fanfare but considerable impact. The industry is consolidating, Nathaniel stated matter-of-factly, as we sat in the informal seating area of my office rather than at the imposing conference table. Together, Reynolds and Axiom could create something truly transformative, a complete security ecosystem that neither of us could build alone. I studied him carefully, noting the passion beneath his measured delivery. Nathaniel had built Axiom from nothing over 15 years, guiding it through both tech booms and busts with remarkable steadiness. Unlike many of his peers, he had a reputation for quiet integrity rather than flamboyant pronouncements. Your timing is interesting, I observed. Reynolds has never been stronger. Our stock is up 47% since I took over as CEO, our client retention is at historic highs, and our innovation pipeline is robust. Why would we consider a merger now? Nathaniel smiled slightly. Precisely because of those strengths, this isn't a rescue mission, Rebecca. It's an opportunity to combine two healthy organizations while we're both operating from positions of power. Most tech mergers happen when one company is faltering. Those rarely succeed. He had a point. The proposal wasn't wholly unexpected. Industry analysts had speculated about potential consolidation for months as cyber threats grew more sophisticated, and clients increasingly sought comprehensive security solutions rather than piecemeal products. And the leadership structure? I asked, cutting to what was often the most contentious aspect of such arrangements. I assume you have thoughts about how governance would work post-merger. I do, Nathaniel acknowledged. I'd like you to be CEO of the combined entity. I would transition to executive chairman, focusing on strategic direction and innovation while you lead day-to-day operations. His proposal caught me off guard. I had expected the typical power struggle where each CEO fought to maintain control, often resulting in awkward co-CEO arrangements that rarely lasted. That's unexpected, I admitted. Most founder CEOs aren't willing to step away from operational control. Nathaniel's expression remained thoughtful. I've been watching how you've transformed Reynolds over the past 2 years. Not just the financial results, but the cultural changes. Your work on recognition, equity, and transparent leadership is exactly what the combined organization would need to successfully integrate two strong cultures. He paused. Besides, I'm in my 60s. I've been thinking about succession planning. This accelerates that timeline, but with someone I believe could preserve and enhance what I've built. I promised to consider the proposal and discuss it with my board, though I made no commitments. After Nathaniel left, I sat alone in my office, contemplating the potential merger from multiple angles: strategic fit, cultural compatibility, client impact, and personal implications. The opportunity was compelling, but I had learned to look beyond surface attractions to deeper patterns and potential complications. That evening, I invited Emma to my home to discuss the surprising development. As both my friend and legal counsel, she brought a unique perspective that balanced personal insight with professional analysis. Nathaniel Chen wants you to run the combined company? Emma asked, clearly surprised as she accepted a glass of wine. That's actually quite remarkable. He's built Axiom into a powerhouse, and founder CEOs don't typically hand over the reins voluntarily. That was my reaction too, I acknowledged, settling onto the sofa across from her. It made me wonder what I might be missing. Is Axiom facing challenges I don't know about? Is Nathaniel looking for a graceful exit? Emma considered this. My firm doesn't represent Axiom, but we have clients who work with them. I haven't heard any negative rumblings, quite the opposite. They're seen as rock solid, if somewhat conservative in their growth strategy. She tilted her head thoughtfully. What does your instinct tell you about his motives? I reflected on my conversation with Nathaniel, trying to discern any hidden agendas beneath his stated rationale. He seemed genuine. There was none of the rehearsed quality I've come to recognize in executives who are selling something they don't fully believe in themselves. I paused. But I've been wrong about people's motives before. James, Emma said quietly, naming the unspoken comparison. Yes. I hadn't thought of him in months, but the parallel was unavoidable. With James, I missed the pattern until it was impossible to ignore. I don't want to make the same mistake with a decision of this magnitude. The difference, Emma pointed out, is that you're not the same person who missed those patterns with James. You've developed a much keener sense for authenticity versus performance. Trust that. She was right. The past 2 years had honed my ability to distinguish between genuine leadership and its carefully constructed facsimile. The recognition equity work had made me particularly attuned to disconnects between words and actions, between stated values and operational realities. There's something else to consider, Emma continued. A merger of this scale would create the dominant player in the cybersecurity sector. That carries both opportunity and responsibility. The combined company would set standards that could shape the entire industry. The thought was simultaneously exhilarating and sobering. Reynolds Tech, under my leadership, had already influenced how many organizations approached recognition, transparency, and inclusive decision-making. A merged entity with Axiom would amplify that impact exponentially. I'll need to do extensive due diligence, I decided. Not just financial and operational, but cultural. I want to understand Axiom's internal dynamics, how decisions really get made, whether their stated values align with actual practices. Emma nodded approvingly. Exactly the right approach. And if you decide to proceed, make cultural integration an explicit part of the merger agreement, not an afterthought. Over the next 6 weeks, I led a comprehensive evaluation of the proposed merger, engaging not just the traditional financial and legal teams, but also bringing in experts in organizational, culture, and change management. I insisted on unprecedented access to Axiom's internal operations, making it clear that cultural compatibility was as critical to my decision as financial projections. What I discovered both impressed and reassured me. Nathaniel had built Axiom with a genuine commitment to ethical practices and employee development. While their approach to recognition and advancement differed from the systems I had implemented at Reynolds, the underlying values were compatible. Most importantly, when we identified potential cultural friction points, Nathaniel engaged constructively, rather than defensively. Your recognition equity framework is more structured than our approach, he acknowledged during one of our integration planning sessions. But I see the value in formalizing what we've tried to do informally. The metrics you've developed for tracking contribution versus recognition are particularly impressive. His willingness to acknowledge the strengths of Reynolds' systems without feeling threatened spoke volumes about his leadership style and personal security. It was the opposite of how James had operated, constantly positioning himself as the source of all valuable insights, incapable of recognizing others' contributions without feeling diminished. When I presented my findings and recommendation to the Reynolds board, the vote to approve the merger was unanimous, a remarkable outcome for such a transformative decision. The strategic rationale is compelling, summarized Victoria Zhao, who had become one of my strongest allies on the board. But more importantly, you've done the cultural due diligence that most mergers neglect until it's too late. If anyone can make this work, it's you, Rebecca. The public announcement of the merger generated exactly the market excitement we had anticipated. Industry analysts praised the strategic fit. Clients expressed optimism about the enhanced capabilities the combined entity would offer, and our respective stock prices rose in tandem. What surprised me was the particular emphasis many commentators placed on the leadership structure. In an industry dominated by founder CEOs reluctant to cede control, Nathaniel Chen's decision to appoint Rebecca Foster as CEO of the merged organization represents a significant departure from typical tech merger patterns, noted one prominent business publication. It signals confidence not just in Foster's operational leadership, but in her cultural transformation of Reynolds Tech over the past 2 years. Another analyst was even more direct. Chen could have insisted on a co-CEO arrangement or maintained operational control. By voluntarily stepping into the executive chairman role, he's demonstrating rare humility and strategic foresight. Foster's emphasis on recognition, equity, and transparent leadership is exactly what will be needed to successfully integrate these two strong cultures. The day after the announcement, I received a surprising email from Mark Reynolds, the founder, who had sold me his controlling interest in Reynolds Tech 3 years earlier. "Congratulations on the Axiom merger," he wrote. "When I chose you as my successor, I believed you would safeguard and enhance what I had built. I never imagined you would transform it so thoroughly, not just in size and scope, but in how leadership itself is practiced. The merger with Axiom creates something neither Nathaniel nor I could have built alone. I'm prouder than I can express to see Reynolds' name attached to this new vision of what a technology company can be. Mark's validation meant more than he could know. He had given me the opportunity that changed the trajectory of my career and life, seeing potential in me that I had barely recognized in myself at the time. As the regulatory review process for the merger proceeded, I focused on detailed integration planning. Rather than relegating cultural integration to HR as an afterthought, I established it as a core work stream with equal priority to technical, financial, and operational integration. We're not just combining products and client lists, I emphasized, in our first all-hands meeting after the announcement. We're bringing together two communities of talented people, each with their own norms, expectations, and ways of working. How thoughtfully we manage that human integration will determine whether this merger ultimately succeeds or fails. 4 months into the planning process, with regulatory approval progressing smoothly, Nathaniel invited me to dinner at a quiet restaurant known for its privacy. I assumed he wanted to discuss some aspect of the integration planning, but his purpose proved more personal. "I wanted to share something with you that isn't widely known," he said after we had ordered. "The real reason I approached Reynolds about a merger, and specifically why I wanted you to lead the combined company." I set down my glass, giving him my full attention. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, he said quietly. "It's manageable with current treatments, and progression is typically slow, but it made me accelerate my succession planning timeline." "Nathaniel, I'm so sorry," I said, genuinely concerned. "Is there anything I can do to support you through this?" He smiled slightly. "You already are. By agreeing to lead the merged company, you're providing exactly the continuity and vision Axiom needs." He paused. "I could have simply promoted internally or brought in another CEO, but watching how you transformed Reynolds convinced me you were the right leader for Axiom's next chapter." "Why didn't you share this during our initial discussions?" I asked gently. "I didn't want the merger evaluation to be influenced by personal circumstances," he explained. "The partnership needed to make strategic sense on its own merits, not as a solution to my health situation. And I didn't want your decision to be complicated by feeling responsible for my legacy." His transparency, even if delayed, reinforced my confidence in our partnership. James would have hidden such information indefinitely, seeing it as a potential weakness. Nathaniel had waited until the merger's strategic rationale was firmly established, then shared his personal circumstances with straightforward dignity. "I appreciate your telling me now," I said. "It doesn't change my commitment to the merger, but it adds another dimension to my sense of responsibility for what we're building together." Nathaniel nodded. "There's something else I wanted to discuss. The name of the combined entity. Traditionally, merged companies either create an entirely new name or use some awkward hyphenation of both. I have a different proposal." "I'm listening," I said, curious about his thinking. "Let's keep it simple. Reynolds Technologies. No hyphenation. No awkward portmanteau." I was genuinely surprised. "You'd be willing to let the Axiom name go entirely? After 15 years of building its reputation?" "Names are important," he acknowledged, "but they're ultimately vehicles for the values and vision they represent. What matters is that we preserve and advance the principles that made both our companies successful." He smiled. "Besides, Reynolds has a better ring to it, and your recognition equity framework will be the cultural cornerstone of the combined organization. The name should reflect that." His generosity of spirit was remarkable, another stark contrast to the zero-sum thinking that had characterized my relationship with James, where James had always positioned himself to receive maximum credit while Giving minimum recognition to others, Nathaniel seemed genuinely comfortable sharing or even ceding the spotlight when it served a greater purpose. As the merger progressed through final regulatory approval and toward closing, I worked closely with both Reynolds and Axiom leadership teams to prepare for day one of the combined organization. Rather than imposing Reynolds' systems wholesale, we carefully evaluated the strengths of both companies' approaches, sometimes adopting Axiom's practices where they were more effective. The recognition equity framework, however, became the non-negotiable cultural foundation of the merged entity. We adapted specific implementations to accommodate differences in functional areas, but the core principles, transparent attribution of contributions, systems to align recognition with actual impact, and metrics to track and correct disparities, remained consistent. A week before the merger officially closed, I scheduled individual conversations with each member of the expanded executive team to discuss expectations and address any lingering concerns. My meeting with Diana Wright, Axiom's chief technology officer who would maintain that role in the combined organization, proved particularly illuminating. "I've been watching how you lead from a distance," Diana said after we had covered the operational aspects of the transition. "The recognition equity work, specifically. It resonates deeply with my own experience." "In what way?" I asked, genuinely interested in her perspective. Diana hesitated, then spoke with careful precision. "I've spent 20 years in technology leadership, often as the only woman in the room. I can't count how many times I've had ideas appropriated or contributions minimized." She met my eyes directly. "What's different about your approach is that it doesn't frame this as a women's issue or a diversity problem. It's a fundamental leadership principle that affects everyone, just in different ways and to different degrees." Her observation crystallized. Something I had intuited but not fully articulated. The universal applicability of recognition equity as a leadership principle, transcending specific demographics or circumstances. "Exactly," I replied. "When we make it about specific groups rather than about aligning contribution with recognition for everyone, we miss the systemic nature of the problem, and we limit potential allies who might not see themselves in a narrower framing." Diana nodded. "That's why Nathaniel has been able to embrace it so fully, despite being a traditionally successful white male founder. He can see how it benefits everyone, including himself, by creating more effective teams and surfacing the best ideas regardless of source." On the day the merger officially closed, I addressed the combined company's 4,800 employees in a globally broadcast town hall. Standing on stage with Nathaniel and the integrated executive team, I felt the weight of responsibility for what we were creating together. Not just a larger cybersecurity company, but a model for how large organizations could operate with genuine transparency and recognition equity. "Today marks not just the combination of two successful companies," I began, looking out at the in-person audience while aware of thousands more watching remotely, "but the beginning of a new kind of technology leader. Together, we have the opportunity to define not just what we build, but how we build it, with integrity, transparency, and a fundamental commitment to recognizing the true value each person brings." I outlined our vision for the integrated company, emphasizing that we would measure our success not just in financial metrics, but in how effectively we aligned recognition with actual contribution at all levels of the organization. "You may wonder why we emphasize this principle so strongly," I continued. "It's because properly attributing ideas and contributions isn't just a matter of fairness, though that would be reason enough. It's about creating an environment where the best thinking can emerge from anywhere in the organization, where innovation isn't limited by hierarchy or presentation style, and where we all benefit from the full range of talents our collective team possesses." As I spoke, I noticed heads nodding throughout the audience. The message resonated across demographic lines, from senior executives to new hires, from technical specialists to support staff. because it addressed a universal human need for acknowledgement and fair recognition. After the formal presentations, as employees mingled during the reception that followed, I observed dozens of small but meaningful interactions. Axiom and Reynolds staff introducing themselves, sharing experiences, beginning to form the connections that would ultimately determine whether our integration succeeded. One conversation particularly caught my attention. Diana Wright, the CTO from Axiom, deep in discussion with Monica Reyes, who had risen to become Reynolds' head of innovation after I had redirected credit for her idea in that executive meeting years earlier. Their animated exchange about potential technology synergies embodied exactly the collaborative spirit we were working to foster. Nathaniel joined me as I watched them. "Promising sign," he observed quietly. "The technical teams are often the hardest to integrate. If Diana and Monica are finding common ground, others will follow their lead. They recognize in each other what they've both experienced," I replied. "The challenge of having their contributions appropriately acknowledged in environments that often favor certain communication styles over others." He nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when we first discussed the recognition equity framework, I understood it intellectually, but watching how it's actually transformed Reynolds' innovation output and employee engagement has been remarkable. People bring their best thinking when they trust it will be properly attributed." "It's actually quite simple," I said. "We've just made explicit and systematic what should have been happening all along." As the integration progressed over the following months, we encountered the inevitable challenges of bringing together two strong organizations: technical systems that didn't easily interconnect, processes that had evolved differently, and the human complexities of blending teams with distinct histories and identities. Throughout it all, the recognition equity framework served as both cultural touchstone and practical problem-solving approach. When integration teams faced difficult decisions about whose systems or approaches to adopt, the framework provided a method for evaluating options based on merit rather than legacy or politics. Ideas were assessed on their actual value, not on who proposed them or which company they originated from. 6 months after the merger closed, the combined Reynolds Technologies was showing stronger than projected results. Client retention had exceeded our targets. We had secured several major new accounts who valued our comprehensive security capabilities. And perhaps most tellingly, employee satisfaction scores were higher than either company had achieved pre-merger. The business press took notice, with multiple publications analyzing what they termed the Reynolds approach to merger integration. One particularly insightful piece in the Harvard Business Review highlighted our emphasis on cultural integration as a driver of successful outcomes. By prioritizing recognition equity and transparent decision-making, Foster and Chen have created an environment where the best ideas can emerge and gain traction regardless of their source, the article noted. This represents a significant departure from traditional merger approaches, where politics and hierarchy often determine which systems and practices survive. On the first anniversary of the merger announcement, about 8 months post-closing, I found myself addressing the Technology Leaders Conference, sharing insights from our integration experience with other executives considering similar strategic moves. The audience included CEOs, board members, and senior leaders from across the technology sector, many of whom had watched our merger with interest. The typical merger playbook focuses almost exclusively on financial and operational integration, I explained. Culture is treated as a soft factor to be addressed after the real work is complete. We inverted that approach, recognizing that culture determines how effectively people collaborate, innovate, and execute. I outlined our recognition equity framework and how it had facilitated more effective integration by creating a meritocratic approach to evaluating ideas and contributions from both legacy organizations. When people trust that their work will be properly acknowledged regardless of their position, background, or communication style, they bring their best thinking to the table, I continued. That's always valuable, but it's absolutely critical during a merger integration when you need to quickly identify and implement the strongest approaches from both organizations. During the Q&A session that followed, a hand rose from the middle of the audience. As the microphone reached the questioner, I felt a momentary jolt of recognition. James. He looked much the same as when I had last seen him nearly 3 years earlier, perhaps with slightly more gray at his temples. His expression was neutral, professional, giving no indication of our shared history. "Rebecca, thank you for the insightful presentation," he began, his broadcaster's voice as smooth as ever. "You've spoken eloquently about recognition equity in large organizations. I'm curious how you ensure this approach scales effectively across different functions and levels. Are there specific metrics you use to track whether recognition is truly aligned with contribution?" The question was substantive and relevant, with none of the personal undertones I might have expected. It was as if he were any other conference attendee seeking practical insights rather than my ex-husband whom I had replaced as a company leader before transforming the organization he had once hoped to run. "Excellent question," I replied, maintaining the same professional tone. "We've developed a multifaceted approach to measurement. At the project level, we use contribution mapping to document who originated key ideas, who developed them, and who implemented them. This creates a transparent record that can be referenced during performance reviews and promotion considerations." I continued outlining our measurement framework, explaining how we combined quantitative metrics with qualitative assessments to identify and address recognition disparities. Throughout my response, I maintained eye contact with James and others in the audience, treating him as I would any other questioner. When the session ended, I was surrounded by attendees with follow-up questions and comments. From the corner of my eye, I saw James slip out of the ballroom without approaching me directly. Part of me was relieved, while another part wondered about the significance of his presence in question. Later that evening, as I prepared for the conference dinner, I received a text from an unknown number. "Impressive presentation today. Your work on recognition equity is transforming how leadership is practiced. Congratulations on all you've built. James." I stared at the message, unsure how to respond or whether to respond at all. After considering several options, I finally typed, "Thank you, James. I appreciate your thoughtful question and kind words." His reply came quickly. "I meant what I said. Watching from a distance how you've transformed Reynolds, merged with Axiom, and created something truly innovative has been educational. I've learned more from observing your leadership than I care to admit." The acknowledgement was unexpected. In our marriage and professional relationship, James had never genuinely recognized my contributions or capabilities. His identity had been too wrapped up in being the star, the recognized leader, the source of all valuable insights. This message suggested a level of self-reflection I hadn't thought him capable of. "That means something coming from you," I replied after careful consideration. "I hope you're well." "Building something new in Colorado," he responded. "Smaller scale, different approach. What you said about patterns and self-awareness in your letter to the shareholders last year resonated deeply. Sometimes we need to lose everything to see what we've been doing wrong." I didn't reply further, feeling that the exchange had reached its natural conclusion. The brief interaction left me with complicated emotions, not regret or lingering attachment, but a certain closure I hadn't realized I still needed. James's recognition of my leadership achievements, delivered without apparent agenda in a forum where he had nothing to gain from flattery, represented a final validation that wouldn't have mattered so much years ago, but now served as an unexpected capstone to my journey. At the conference dinner, I found myself seated next to Nathaniel, who had also been speaking on a different panel. Though his Parkinson's symptoms were still mild, I had noticed the occasional tremor in his left hand, carefully disguised, but visible to those who knew to look. "I saw James Foster in your session today," he mentioned quietly. That must have been unexpected. It was, I acknowledged, somewhat surprised that Nathaniel had made the connection. Though my history with James wasn't secret, we rarely discussed it. His question was actually quite insightful, Nathaniel observed, about scaling recognition equity across different functions and levels. It's something we're still refining. Yes, I agreed. Whatever else has transpired between us, James always had a good strategic mind. He just employed it in service of the wrong priorities. I paused. He texted me afterward, said he's learned from watching my leadership approach. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Interesting. That suggests significant personal growth on his part. Perhaps, I said noncommittally, or perhaps just recognition of objective success. Either way, it felt like a fitting conclusion to that chapter. As the dinner progressed, we shifted to discussing the next phase of Reynolds Technologies: evolution, new product development, expansion into adjacent markets, and continued refinement of our recognition equity framework. The encounter with James faded into perspective, a brief reconnection with my past that served to highlight how completely I had moved beyond it. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I found myself reflecting not just on the brief exchange with James, but on the entire journey that had brought me to this point. From the humiliation of being dismissed as just his wife at that award ceremony to leading one of the most respected companies in the technology sector, the path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet each challenge, each pattern recognized and disrupted, had contributed to building something I couldn't have envisioned when this journey began. Not just a successful career or company, but a new model for how leadership could be practiced and how contribution could be recognized. The true measure of growth, I realized, wasn't in James's belated acknowledgement of my capabilities, gratifying though that might be. It was in how completely I had transcended the need for such validation, in how thoroughly I had internalized my own value independent of anyone else's recognition or lack thereof. The recognition equity framework that had transformed first Reynolds and now the merged organization hadn't emerged despite my experience with James, but because of it. The very patterns that had diminished me had ultimately led to creating systems that elevated everyone. There was a certain poetic justice in that evolution, that the seeds of transformation had been planted in the moment of greatest diminishment, that just his wife had ultimately created something far beyond what either of us could have imagined when our paths were still intertwined. Tomorrow, I would return to Houston and the work of leading Reynolds Technologies into its next chapter. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the significance of this full-circle moment, to appreciate not just how far I had come, but how that journey had created ripples that now extended far beyond my individual experience to transform, how contribution and recognition were aligned for thousands of others. The real victory wasn't in proving James wrong about my capabilities or value. It was in creating environments where no one would ever again be dismissed as just anything, where each person's contributions would be seen, acknowledged, and valued for exactly what they were, no more and no less. That, I reflected as I finally drifted toward sleep, was a legacy worth building, one conversation, one decision, one recognition at a time. 5 years after the merger that created the new Reynolds Technologies, I stood in the glass-walled conference room of our headquarters, watching the sunset paint the Houston skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The expansive views from the 35th floor never failed to provide perspective, especially on milestone days like today. "There you are," Emma said, entering with 2 champagne flutes. "Hiding from your own celebration? The party's going strong downstairs." I smiled, accepting the glass. "Just taking a moment. It's been quite a journey." Today marked both my 5th anniversary as CEO of the merged company and the official announcement of my planned transition. After months of careful succession planning with the board, we had named Monica Reyes as the next CEO, the same Monica whose idea James had once attempted to appropriate, and who had risen through the ranks to become our chief strategy officer. The selection sent a clear message about our continued commitment to recognition equity and merit-based advancement. To Monica, Emma toasted, raising her glass. And to you, the leader who made her rise possible by creating systems where talent couldn't be overlooked or credit misappropriated. We clinked glasses as the setting sun cast long shadows across the city below. She'll take Reynolds further. Then I could, I said with genuine pride. Her technical background gives her insights I've always had to rely on others for. That's what great leaders do, Emma observed. They select successors who complement rather than mirror them. Speaking of which, have you decided what's next for Rebecca Foster? I turned from the window to face my oldest friend. The board's creating an innovation fellowship to focus on expanding the recognition equity framework beyond corporate environments, educational institutions, nonprofits, government agencies. They've asked me to lead it. Perfect, Emma nodded, approvingly. Broader impact without day-to-day operational responsibilities. You'll transform systems rather than run them. The fellowship represented everything I had come to value most, creating environments where contribution and recognition aligned properly, where hierarchies served purpose rather than power, where merit transcended presentation. While I had loved leading Reynolds, the opportunity to spread these principles more widely called to me deeply. There's something else, I added. Mark Reynolds and Nathaniel Chen are funding a university research center dedicated to equity systems and organizational psychology. They've asked me to chair the advisory board. The three of you working together again, Emma mused. Who would have imagined that when you were sitting in that ballroom hearing James call you just his wife? The mention of that pivotal moment no longer triggered pain or anger, just a quiet acknowledgement of how completely I had transcended it. Life takes unexpected turns, I agreed. Speaking of which, did I tell you James emailed last month? Emma's eyebrows shot up. No, you most certainly did not. What did he want? He's created a leadership development program for his company in Colorado. Wanted my permission to incorporate elements of the recognition equity framework. The irony is almost too perfect, Emma laughed. The man who couldn't recognize your contributions now teaching others about proper attribution. Did you grant permission? I nodded. With proper citation requirements and attribution guidelines, yes, the principles should spread as widely as possible, regardless of source. That's the whole point of what we've built. Emma studied me with the knowing look of someone who had witnessed every step of my journey. You've truly come full circle. No lingering resentment, no need for vindication. Those emotions served their purpose, I acknowledged. They provided necessary fuel at the beginning. But building something sustainable requires moving beyond personal grievance to universal principles. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Monica stood in the doorway, her expression both excited and slightly apologetic. Sorry to intrude, but they're asking for you downstairs. The formal announcement toast is in 10 minutes. We'll be right there, I assured her. As Monica left, Emma linked her arm through mine, ready to introduce your successor to the world. I took a final look at the darkening skyline, then turned toward the door with conviction. More than ready, this was never about building a personal kingdom. It was about creating systems where everyone's contributions receive proper recognition, including knowing when it's time to create space for new leadership. Downstairs, hundreds of employees, board members, clients, and industry partners had gathered to celebrate the leadership transition. As I took the stage to formally introduce Monica as the next CEO of Reynolds Technologies, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with dismissal and diminishment had culminated in creating spaces where others could be fully seen and valued. Leadership isn't about positions or titles, I told the assembled crowd. It's about seeing possibilities others miss, recognizing contributions others overlook, and building systems where merit transcends bias. Monica Reyes embodies these principles, and I can think of no one better qualified to lead Reynolds into its next chapter. As applause filled the room, I caught Nathaniel's eye in the front row. Though his Parkinson's had progressed, requiring a mobility aid, his mind remained sharp as ever. He nodded his approval, understanding the significance of this moment, not just for Reynolds, but for the movement we had built together. The company would continue evolving under Monica's leadership, but the cultural foundation would remain, a legacy far more meaningful than any individual achievement. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that being just his wife had never been my destiny. It had merely been the catalyst that propelled me toward becoming exactly who I was meant to be, entirely, unapologetically, and powerfully, myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.